Uh, just a word, because this is a developing summit. Obviously, Ukraine is being discussed, the situation in Iran being discussed as well. As to the NATO mission in Iraq, we remember with the drone wars ongoing, the Gulf states affected, the NATO base in Iraq affected, the mission there, I should say, in Iraq. We're now hearing from the commander, this is in the last few minutes, the French General Christophe Incy, saying that they are trying to get back to that NATO mission in Iraq. He said this at the NATO fringes of the conference, saying, quote, when, why, how, we have no idea. But the determination, he said, is in our bones. Let's bring in Dr. Gavin Hall, expert on NATO, teaching fellow in political science and international security at the University of Strathclyde. Welcome to the programme, Dr. Hall. Great to have you with us tonight. Let's begin on your take of this summit. I've heard from some old contacts, diplomats in Europe, saying this was hectoring today. Reassurance, how would you describe the tone?
Yes, well, good evening. I think reassurance is probably a good phrase to be using. As your correspondent in Washington alluded to, this has been this meeting of the foreign ministers today is taking place amongst continued US challenges to the validity and the role of NATO in the modern security architecture. So there's been the widespread critique of NATO for not offering sufficient support, not only in Iran, but also to do with Israel-Palestine. The week started off with criticism of Spain, particularly for not really pulling its weight. But then we have had some more substantive developments occurring during this week. So on Tuesday, you had meetings of the defence chiefs in Brussels of NATO, who actually discussed developing a formal European NATO structure within as part of the alliance. So rather than there being the individual countries, it would actually be a European bloc. How that develops, who exactly can say at this time, but it's an interesting move. Also, we saw yesterday that may well have sparked the move towards Poland. The Polish reinforcement today is combined Belarus-Russian nuclear exercises that took place in Belarus that may have sharpened some people's minds. And then, of course, today you have the foreign ministers meeting in Helsingborg, which is quite very symbolic because it's taking place in Sweden, one of the new members of NATO that was admitted directly in response to Russian action. So there's lots of moving parts and changing things. But if you actually look at what Mark Rutte was saying today in his sort of doorstep before the meetings took place, he said deter and defend about 3 or 4 times during that, referencing what NATO's core mission is. And Marco Rubio, when he was talking alongside Rutte before going into the meetings today, referencing Iran, he was trying to frame the American operations in Iran as very much being a defensive measure. So he was saying about how there should be no nuclear weapons in Iran, there should be no enrichment capabilities, there should be no stockpiles. The Strait of Hormuz has to be open, it can't be a toll. So there does seem to be this kind of move to try and set things up ahead of the Ankara summit in early July, that what the support the United States is asking for is for defensive operations, which is part of NATO's core mission. Therefore, there should be support. Whether that's accepted and what the other members of NATO actually think about this, we're going to find out in the coming days.
You mean, just to clarify, you mean defensive operations in the Strait of Hormuz, depending on whether there is still a current or we're dealing with the aftermath of the conflict?
Yeah, I mean, Rubio, he was specifically talking about Iranian plans or potential plans to introduce some kind of toll there, charging shipping and things, and then thereby that having a knock-on effect on oil supplies, which would obviously create security challenges because maybe we then don't have security of energy, not just in Europe, but countries around the world. Therefore, if there's an operation to free up and open up the straits so there's clear and free access for everyone, it's actually a defensive operation because it's enhancing every Euro-Atlantic security because we have security of supply.
It's interesting because the so-called coalition of the willing, you'll know, not too long ago, Keir Starmer was here, the British Prime Minister, with President Macron. They had many countries, many leaders looking at the challenges of the Strait of Hormuz. And they get, as you know, to the central question, what do we do? Do we have a kind of defensive maritime support fleet of vessels? And the agreement was that wasn't the way forward, to be trying to kind of strike and maybe exacerbating the situation, the view of President Macron. It was to kind of guide these ships and assess the threat, likely in the aftermath of any conflict. And you're right to say as well, this week it's reported that Iran and Oman have been talking about this toll system, going off the back of President Trump saying this is the antithesis of what he wants to see. On the idea of forced posture, let me just read you. This is Max Delaney, one of my colleagues at AFP, saying this in the room today. Trump, quote, left heads spinning after the message was given by Marco Rubio, foreign ministers trying to understand what had happened, sending 5,000 troops to Poland, given the withdrawal of 5,000 troops from Berlin, this apparent reversal. It sounds like a back of a fag packet. Marco Rubio says it wasn't. Was it?
Well, I think it's certainly a change in posture, but I think if you look at President Trump's first term in office and also now in his second term, there do seem to be lots of statements that come out, and specifically relating to NATO, whereby Donald Trump says something and then the actual policy that comes out at the end of it is almost the opposite. Why he's doing this is up for debate, but it may be some form of negotiating tactic, trying to play into his sort of perceived image as the great deal maker, whereby he wants European countries to take more responsibility for their own defence and not just relying on the United States. And it seems that his sort of way of trying to achieve that is almost by goading people effectively in trying to sort of get their backs up. Well, you're not doing enough, getting the critique out there, that then forces them to respond in some way, shape or form. Whether it was a genuine mistake announcing the withdrawal and the non-rotation of troops into Poland, and whether this is a new 5,000 troops is up for debate, but the fact that it's being packaged the day after combined Russian, Belarusian nuclear exercises is very much a clear signalling thing, and very much getting to what we said at the start about this being a reassurance message that's trying to be put forward as sort of the main outcome out of this summit. But it does indicate that the United States is still committed to Europe. In European security, that seems to be the message that is eventually coming through, despite the changes or reversals of opinion, shall we say.
Well, let's try and patch the thread and see where we end up, because on that, those exercises, this is Belarus and this is Russian nuclear drills going on, concluding on May the 21st, so 3 days. We're talking about Iskander missiles, units being tested, these nuclear deployment drills, what they say, Russians and Belarusian officials, that this is routine planned training. However, Mark Rutte today told the press, Gavin, that there were areas of military secretive information that he simply couldn't pass on, which may go to your point, what you were mentioning. He also went on to talk about the idea of Article 5. Let's have a listen to what he said.
I know some have been questioning that bond, and perhaps even questioning the resolve of this alliance to remain united in the face of an adversary. So let me be crystal clear. Allies' commitment to Article 5 is ironclad. Our resolve and ability to defend every ally is absolute. Were anyone to be foolish as to attack us, the response would be devastating.
To what extent, Dr. Hall, do you think you can have an ironclad commitment in an alliance where the most senior, powerful member of it has a transactional relationship with all of his allies?
There are just sort of two main points associated with this. First of all, factually, Article 5 says that you must come to the aid of your allies and do what you deem necessary. And it's that phrase, what you deem necessary, that allows the wiggle room to come into it as to whether that actually means employing actual military force in support of your allies. The second part of that, though, is very much the normative understanding that this is the one for all clause. It does lead to, will involve military support, and if one's attacked, then everyone defends them there. And that's pretty much very clear and understood. And if that military support wasn't to be forthcoming in the event of an armed attack, then it would pretty much signal the end of NATO, because it would then be the paper tiger, as Putin and others have referred to it in the past there. So, yes, there is wiggle room within the actual what the treaty actually says for commitment, but everyone is clear about what that commitment actually means in reality, and that is you do defend your allies.
And if we have active European NATO members discussing, preparing, quote, Plan B, a more European NATO, what do you think that, in terms of a realistic feasibility, how many years away are we from something like that?
Well, I think that's going to would take quite a while to be resolved, because not least there'll be significant debates about who's going to be the main figurehead within that. Would it be France? Would it be Germany? Would it be the United Kingdom? Who would be the overall sort of the top military leadership that would be in charge of that? Which countries would they come from? Would it be on a rotational basis? These types of issues. And I think those are not easy problems to actually solve. But what is clear, I think, as well, is that whilst all these nice debates are going on, the continued fighting in Ukraine against Russia and the lessons that are being learned from that is particularly leading towards the ability of drones and other unmanned vehicles that actually enable significant military capability to be able to be delivered without actually with minimising having too many troops available directly in the front lines there. And how this sort of new technological aspect of warfare fighting is actually brought in and incorporated into NATO force posture and plans, I think is a much bigger area than quite how everything's structured together. So it's more how to incorporate these new technologies and lessons rather than how the actual formal structure sits within NATO decision making, I'd say, is the more pertinent area at the moment.
And just a very brief point on that more pertinent area, and I don't know if you have information on this, but it is an area that I think there's a lot of questions about at the moment. You've talked about the transformative nature, not just of drones, but drones combined with AI. There is increasing talk of Russian GPS spoofing, which appears to have consequences this week and last week in the Baltics, with Ukrainian drones either shot down or not in Estonia and not in Latvia, which brought down the government effectively. The stray drone entered the territory, wasn't detective, the Defence Secretary was sacked, the Prime Minister of the coalition fell apart. Now, there are questions about whether this was Russia's electronic warfare deliberately diverting Ukrainian drones from their targets in Russia. What's your reading of that?
Oh, in the deployment of military capabilities in pretty much every conflict since the dawn of time, there have been issues of blue on blue, friendly fire, issues of mistaken identity. You only have to go back to, say, the first Gulf War during Operation Desert Storm, where UK Warrior armoured vehicle was targeted by an American Thunderbolt aircraft and killed, I think, the 15 or 16 people in it. So these types of things do happen. Obviously, Russia would be very prepared to say, yes, this was us, this was GPS spoofing, look at what we can actually do. The truth is probably somewhere in between the lines. There may have been some form of Russian interference that's then created a confusion or a reset in the program that's then helped lead to the outcome. But whether it's the ability, Russia having the ability to take command and control of Ukrainian drones and send them to go elsewhere, I think that's possibly a little bit wishful thinking on their behalf.
Really good to talk to you. Thank you, Dr. Hall. Really nice to have that context and clarity. Dr. Gavin Hall, expert on NATO and teaching fellow of political science at the University of Strathclyde.